Friends, we have followed Ignatius in the beginning of his journey from his birthplace in Loyola to Arevalo, where he works in the court, then to Pamplona, where he goes to fight and is injured by that cannonball, to his convalescence in Loyola, and then the beginnings of his conversion as he convalesces in that room in Loyola, starting to notice his interior movements. And we know that he sets off to Montserrat, where he lays down his sword, and then he goes to the small town of Manresa. And he spends 11 months in Manresa. Manresa is the birthplace of the spiritual exercises that we now, many years later, are still benefiting from. And during his time in Manresa, he does a number of different things. So, for example, he spends much of his days begging for his own survival, moving around, asking people to give him what he needs to survive. What he doesn't use, he shares with other people. He works in a hospice where he helps those who are sick and those caring for the sick. And we also know he devotes many hours a day to prayer. He has a special devotion in Manresa to the Holy Trinity. And he tells how one day, after visiting the monastery for prayer, which is today the Basilica of Lisieux, leaving that monastery, he has a spiritual experience where the Trinity are like three notes, three chords, and he can hear each one independently, but he also hears the harmony of these notes playing together. And he says this leaves him with a great joy, a great consolation, and brings him to tears. But I want to go back to one of the most pivotal experiences that Ignatius has in Manresa, and that's his spiritual experience at the river Cardonner. Ignatius at the river Cardonner has an experience that he will talk about for the rest of his life. And in fact, he tells us that that experience is one that he never forgets, that something happened there that made him a new man. Writing about him many years later, his first secretary, Jerome Nadal, says that Ignatius was confident in that moment that God was leading him. He did not know where God was leading him, but that God was leading him. But that's not all that happens at the Cardonner. At the Cardonner, Ignatius says he's able to see with his inner eye, that he sees something new that he has never seen before. He sees how God is in all things, and he sees how the whole world from where he sits looking at the Cardonner is shot through with divine love, that in every single thing God is present. And so he has this deep sense of God in all things. But it's also there at the Cardonner that his relationship with Christ is transformed. Remember, when Ignatius sets off, he wants to do two things. He wants to follow in the footsteps of Christ, and he wants to live imitating one of the saints in rigorous penance. But he learns something very different at the Cardonner. It's not just a question of following Christ. Ignatius feels within himself a desire to help souls. And he realizes at the Cardonner that it's not just a question of following Christ, but that Christ is inviting him to be a co-worker, to cooperate with him, to be a companion with him in bringing about the reign of God's kingdom. that Ignatius now realizes that he is going to walk side by side with Christ. And he sees Christ as the King sent by the Father, the one who will draw all people to salvation. And he, Ignatius, a poor sinner, knows that he is loved by God and now is invited to be a co-worker with Christ in bringing others to salvation. And so we see how his relationship shifts from simply following Christ to cooperating with Christ, to working and laboring with Christ to bring about the reign of God's kingdom. And it's also at the Cardinal that Ignatius begins to see that the Lord is inviting him to be with him for his greater glory. Now, Ignatius wanted to imitate the saints and to live a life of rigorous penance. Notice the shift there that takes place. Suddenly, Ignatius realizes that what he does is not just simply for imitating the saints, but rather it is for the greater glory of God, a phrase that he will then use over and over and over again. That experience at the Cardinal brings about a real shift. If we look at the first part of Ignatius's life, he is quite self-centered. I am going to go in the footsteps of Christ. I am going to imitate the saints. I am going to do rigorous penance. And notice the shift that takes place. He still wants to follow Christ, but he becomes God-centered. It's not about what he wants to do, but it's about doing everything for the greater glory of God. And so there is a wonderful movement from looking at himself, pondering himself, and now looking out from the way that God sees. And this brings to a close his time in Manresa. Ignatius then decides that he must journey towards Barcelona so that he can get a ship to Venice and go to the Holy Land. He still wants to go and walk where Christ walked. And in actual fact, he also says now he wants to go to the Holy Land to walk where Christ walked, but he also wants to be there to help souls, that he is now going to cooperate with the Lord. And so he sets off to Barcelona, still being rather cautious that he doesn't meet too many people that he knows. And he goes off to Barcelona, travels to Venice, gets permission to go to the Holy Land. Now, in those days, it was quite difficult to go to the Holy Land. There was a war going on with the Turks, and so you couldn't just enter the Holy Land. But Ignatius gets permission to go to the Holy Land. And he arrives there and is overwhelmed because he has now the chance to walk in the very places where Jesus himself walked. He visits Bethlehem and Bethpage and the Mount of Olives, all those places he's heard and seen that Jesus was in the scriptures. But Ignatius runs into some difficulty in the Holy Land. Because of the war, the custodians of the Holy Land, the Franciscans, tell him that he is unable to stay in the Holy Land, that he must leave. Well, Ignatius still has a stubborn streak in him, and Ignatius does not want to leave the Holy Land. Eventually, the Franciscans say to him, "We will have you excommunicated from the church if you do not leave the Holy Land." So, under duress, Ignatius agrees that he will go back to Barcelona. But before he goes, Ignatius has a desire to visit the Mount of Olives again. And he tells a wonderful story in his autobiography of how he sneaks out of the Franciscan monastery where he's being held. He goes to the Mount of Olives. He meets a guard at the gate of the Mount of Olives, and he has to bribe that guard to get in to the Mount of Olives. So he pulls a penknife out of his pocket. He may have laid down his sword in Montserrat, but he still had a penknife in his pocket. And the guard lets him in to the Mount of Olives. And he wants to go and check where the left and the right foot of Jesus was when he was on the Mount of Olives. While he's in the Mount of Olives, he decides that he wants to visit Bethpage. So he leaves the Mount of Olives and goes to Bethpage. Same story again. They say, you can't enter. Ignatius digs in another pocket and finds a scissors, and he bribes the guards there with the scissors so that he can visit Bethpage. By this time, the Franciscans in their monastery are really angry because this man has disappeared. And so they send out some people to go and find him. They're going to now punish him and lock him up. He's in a little bit of hot water. But one of the people that finds Ignatius, he manages to negotiate with, and this man lets him free. And so Ignatius goes straight to the harbor, gets on a boat, and he leaves the Holy Land. He's in a bit of difficulty now. He believes that it was God's will that he should go to the Holy Land to walk where Jesus walked and to help souls. Now, suddenly, for the circumstances, the reality around him, he discovers that this may not have been God's will for him at that time. But he realizes something else, that in order to help souls, he needs himself to learn some of the basics of the Christian faith. The Christian world at that time is in turmoil. It's around the time of the Reformation, and people are suspicious of anybody who teaches meditation or prayer or the basics of the Christian faith if they do not have the academic background. So Ignatius decides, in order to help souls, he must have an academic formation. So he goes back to Barcelona. He runs into another difficulty. In order to study theology and to read the textbooks of the day, he needs to understand Latin. Ignatius has no Latin whatsoever. So he goes back to Latin classes with schoolboys in Barcelona. Now imagine, 33 years old, sitting with teenage boys trying to learn Latin. Ignatius does this because he knows that this will help him ultimately work for the greater glory of God. While he's in Barcelona, he also teaches the basics of the faith and teaches people meditation, tries to enter into spiritual conversations. And when he has acquired the Latin that he needs, he moves to the Spanish town of Alcalá, where he begins his academic formation. Now, this is not without difficulties. Ignatius is teaching the basics of the Christian faith. He is teaching meditation. And for the first time in Alcalá, he's also offering others the spiritual exercises. And soon, the Inquisition get after him. How can this man, who has no academic theology, be teaching people the basics of the faith and prayer and offering these spiritual exercises? There's a great suspicion about his spiritual exercises. They arrest Ignatius, they put him on trial, they can't really find any theological error in the spiritual exercises. They lock him in jail for 42 days. When he gets out, he decides that he still wants to continue teaching and offering the exercises, so best he move on somewhere else. And by the grace of another cleric in Alcalá, they say to him, go to Salamanca. There you will be able to go to college and also be able to continue with your formation. And so Ignatius hits the road again and he goes to Salamanca. But in Salamanca, Ignatius falls foul once again of the Inquisition. And this time, not the Franciscans, but the Dominicans get after him. And it's quite intriguing because when Ignatius was thinking about imitating the saints, Dominic and Francis were two of the saints that he mentions, and both now seem to give him a difficulty. The Dominicans invite Ignatius around for dinner one evening. They begin to enter into a theological conversation with him. They ask him questions about his spiritual exercises. But what he doesn't know is the Dominicans have a jail under their priory. And they decide that this man is suspect. And so what happens is they take Ignatius down into the dungeon, and the Dominicans lock him up in that dungeon, and eventually they put him on trial. He goes through an extended trial where they again examine these spiritual exercises. They're looking for theological error. And like in Alcalá, they cannot find any theological error. So they eventually have to release Ignatius. But he is warned that he may not at all do anything publicly. He may not teach meditation, teach children, or offer these spiritual exercises. The Jesuits, of course, have long forgiven the Dominicans for what they did to Ignatius. But Ignatius decides that it would be better for him to head off to Paris, to go to finish his theological studies in Paris. And so that is what he does. He goes to Paris, he begs alms every day to be able to pay the bills, and he attends college. And in Paris, Ignatius begins to gather around him companions. He has 6 companions eventually, but he meets others who are inspired by him, others who see the kind of life that he is living and feel that they too want to live that life. And some of them, Ignatius begins to offer the spiritual exercises to. And so they go through this process. And it's in Paris that the spiritual exercises take really their literary form as we have them today. Ignatius is offering these spiritual exercises. He's noticing what happens. He's reflecting on the experience of others, and he is continually adapting them and rewording things so that he can bring in as many of his own reflections and the experience of others as possible. And eventually, he has these exercises in a complete form. Ignatius is known in Paris, is called, he says, accused of being a seducer of students. Why? Because there are people who see him and are inspired by him, and they decide that they want to give up the life that they are pursuing and live the same kind of life that this man, this Spaniard, has chosen to live. And so, slowly, a group of companions gather and decide that together they want to live the life that Ignatius is living. And very important for these companions is the idea of poverty, that they would try to follow the poor Christ as best as they can. They're not sure what shape their future will take, but they want to follow the poor Christ in a certain way of life. They finish their studies, and these companions gather together in a place in Paris called Montmartre, where they take simple vows that they will follow this poor Christ. And now they have to decide on what their future will be. So they enter into a time together of discerning where and how they will go once they have finished all they need to in Paris. Some have already been ordained priests, others will still be ordained. And the group decide that they will make a pilgrimage together to the Holy Land, if they could get to the Holy Land. And then they say if they can't get to the Holy Land, what they will do is they will go to Rome and put themselves at the disposal of the Pope. They will offer their services to the universal church in the person of the Pope. And so the companions decide this is the way forward. They will scatter, and eventually they will meet up in Venice, and they will see if they can get to the Holy Land. Well, they spend a year in Venice, and they are unable to get a ship to the Holy Land because of the difficulties, the political situation, and the war that continues in the Holy Land. So they decide that they will head for Rome and see what happens in Rome. Now, this is a very significant period in the life of Ignatius. Not only have we seen how his image of God is transformed from a God that was simply a concept to a God who was judging, a God who was demanding, then to a God of love and a God of mercy. But we also see how Ignatius's own identity shifts, his identity changes, that he will be someone who is going to follow Christ and do rigorous penance, to now being someone who will follow Christ, but also help souls, seeking always to do what will be for the greater glory of God. Ignatius comes to see how he has been created by God, how he has been called by God, and how he is chosen by God, that he is a loved sinner, and yet God still has a task for him, and not just simply a task, but Ignatius will labor with Jesus, cooperate with Jesus in bringing the good news to the men and women of his time. But Ignatius discovers something else. Ignatius discovers that his own desire, his own dream to help souls is not just simply his dream. He discovers that when he goes deep into himself, when he's in touch with his own deepest desires, that there too he will find God. That it is also God who has dreams for Ignatius, God who has desires for Ignatius. Ignatius encounters Jesus in Manresa in a real, tangible way. And then Ignatius learns through his intimacy with Christ that he is called into a cooperative relationship, that he is called to be a co-worker for the kingdom. And he learns too that he cannot do this alone, that he will need companions that will accompany him and help him on this mission that is opened up before him. He learns that his dreams are also God's dreams for him. And so, with this great consolation, Ignatius and his companions head for Rome to find out what it is that the Lord will do with them when they get to that place where they see the center of the church and their ability there to be of service for the greater glory of God.
The image of the poor Christ is a very powerful image in the exercises. And it's one that I find very, very challenging for myself. It's one that challenges me in terms of my own attachments to material things. And so the poor Christ constantly brings to the surface my own attachment to comfort and my own attachment to material possessions. So it keeps that on the radar screen of my life.
Poverty is a very important concept in the spiritual exercises because Ignatius sees Christ always as the poor Christ, and he speaks in the text throughout the exercises of the poor Christ. And for Ignatius, this poverty is a physical poverty, but it also is a poverty of spirit. It is making space, not cluttering one's life, but making space physically and interiorly so that one can follow Christ wholeheartedly.